I come from a country that is about to face presidential elections. And when we talk about data, and we talk about cybersecurity, and we talk about protecting information, it really comes down to at least some of the discussions we're having in Mexico right now as to how these issues are affecting the electoral process. And we've had a lot of discussions about this, and of course, it's been a very interesting debate because at one point, some of us were already talking about the Russians, involvement in the Mexican elections, and then we're talking about the use of data by different consulting groups. So I thought it was fascinating that the Women's Forum was interested in talking about this issue because it's clearly an issue that is affecting not only the basics of how our democracies functions, but it really comes down to that checks and balances between, how much can we protect our information? What are our rights in terms of protecting our information? And then versus, all these other issues and the difficulty that technology is bringing about in terms of protecting this information. Now, the other interesting aspect of this panel, and we talked about it when we were preparing, is how do we make this issue a gender issue and a women's issue? What are the roles of women in looking at data, understanding the technology, trying to understand the role of women in this new world of cybersecurity and the use of data, for example, in trying to foresee the future. And when I say foresee the future, and I'm going to apologize to you, I'm going to apologize to my panelists, because I always view some of these issues from the national security perspective, because I worked within the national security environment. So when we talk about data, of course, it's just very easy to think about this. Oh my goodness, how do you use data in the national security environment but protecting people's rights and privacy? So we have all these big issues, and then we have to bring it down to let's talk about women and one of the focus of this year. So when we were conversing, I know you had, I haven't been presenting our guests because I know you all have their bios and information in front of you. But Rahav Harfoush, she's a co-founder of the Red Thread Inc. She's also an adjunct professor. And I know you've been working, and I just want to jump into this part that has to do with women participating in terms of data and cybersecurity. So why don't we start with you?
Okay, it's a big, I'll try to,
it's huge.
I know. Jump in. Hi everybody, I'm Rahav. I'm a digital anthropologist, which means that my work focuses on the intersection of culture and technology and how the tools that we're using and the data that we're generating is influencing our lives in ways that we might not be aware of. So when we talk about cybersecurity, when we talk about a lot of these tools, we tend to focus on the technical aspect. We talk about hacking, we talk about code, we talk about big data, we talk about servers. But one of the things that we don't really talk about is how this data is enabling all of us to live in an era of unprecedented technological intimacy, and how the data that we're generating is influencing our beliefs, it's influencing our worldviews, but that our worldviews and our beliefs are also influencing the data in return and the tools that we use in turn. And so what I really want to focus on as we kind of have this big conversation is to ground us in the fact that we need to pay attention to all of the hidden social ways that this data is influencing us. And I'll give you two very quick examples. The first is recognizing that because all of this information that we're living in a world of data abundance, which means that never before have we been able to produce and generate as much information. Think about just how you used data in the last, 3-4 hours since you've been here. If you've checked your email or a social network or sent a text, we're generating massive amounts of information. And that information has led to the development of algorithms and the developments of software that crunches all this information and gives us products and services that we need, right? The thing that we need to keep in mind, however, is that by choosing to live in a world that is driven by algorithms, that in addition to all the benefits that we get, Netflix knows what you want to watch, Amazon knows what books you want to order, we're also in a sense saying that we are choosing a world where our personal worldview might be more important to us than an objective worldview. So at the very beginning is recognizing that some of these tools might have an impact on how we're making decisions. The second quick example is kind of a fun one. It's a Snapchat example, which looks at how sometimes the technology that we use sells us back certain belief systems anyway. So who here uses Snapchat? Okay. Do you guys know the filter with the flower crown, right? Everyone's like, yes, I know, it looks great. So that filter, when it first originally was introduced, did something really interesting, because in addition to just putting a crown on your head, in addition to just, it was supposed to make you look pretty. But the way that it made you look pretty was it lightened your skin, it made your eyes bigger, it made your eyes lighter, it pointed your chin, it gave you cheekbones, it changed your face shape a little bit. So think about what this says in terms of a message about beauty standards to a way that we use something for fun that is still sending a message about how you look. So when we can talk about all of this, I want to ground this in the idea that for women especially, a lot of the ways that we use the internet has also been weaponized against us as well, and that is in itself a security issue. Look at any woman journalist, politician, anybody who speaks up against a cause, and you will see them getting backlash, threatened, you will see them getting doxxed where their personal information is leaked. So while it is important to talk about hacking and cybersecurity and big data, we cannot overstate the impact that this is having on our culture. When Facebook decides what friends you stay in touch with, when Twitter decides what voice should be amplified, when Google decides what results should be hidden and what's going to be presented to you, those are going to compromise your abilities to make decisions, and those decisions are going to impact our ability as citizens to make well-informed democratic choices.
This raises one of the big issues, and Anja, I know you and we spoke about this also. Anja Guaidén-Gelpa, I'm sorry, my Mexican accent. Anja. She's a chancellor of the State Republican Canton of Geneva. I mean, it raises the issue then, what should be the role, for example, of government in terms of calling on Snapshot that is doing this, in terms of, in terms of policy, as we're trying to promote diversity. Snapshot, you are basically telling your users that this is what women should look like. And so it raises a question, should government step in? Who steps in?
Data is the new fuel of the digital world, that's for sure. And data can be very powerful. It can help us, it can help governments to design effective and purposeful policies, but it can also be evil, and we have seen that unfortunately a lot. When companies are influencing voters, when they're micro-targeting, that's a very, very dangerous part. But at least the scandal of Cambridge Analytica and Zuckerberg helped us to make that issue visible, because everything was known a year ago. Cambridge Analytica, it was all in newspapers, not in all newspapers, but some newspapers. I talked about it in the last Women's Forum in Paris. But nobody cared. Nobody cared. Nobody could remember Cambridge Analytica. And so that had raised that up. The question which is very important for me is, who owns the data? Is it the citizens? Is it the data collector? Is it the data processor? And that's a really, really important point. And I think there are two approaches to that. The first one, I would call it the liberal libertarian approach, where data is personal. It belongs to the person. It's their only right to decide what they want to do with that. And in that case, to empower citizens, we should create a market where the citizen can sell their data, and blockchain could make sure that these transactions
Could you explain
go
in 30 seconds what blockchain is? Because that still is such a, I know you only have 30 seconds. Can you do, seriously, what is blockchain? I mean,
blockchain would be a decentralized, so there is not one, there's not government taking care of everything, there's not a company taking care of everything, but it's a decentralized contract. And so people could sell their data, and in that case, the role of government would be reduced to ensure the reinforcement of the property right. That's all. Or maybe we could say public administration should educate people, should help them to survive in the digital world. So that's the liberal libertarian approach. The other one is more a republic approach. In that case, personal data are rights that have to be protected. And in that case, private and public operators have to be regulated and supervised by government and by independent agencies. And in that case, government or public administration have to protect citizens and have even to protect them from themselves.
Law enforcement, are we talking about law enforcement agencies that would have the responsibility?
And it's the same case in a lot of countries. It's forbidden to sell one of your organs. Why is it forbidden? You can say, well, that's your body. You can sell one of your lungs. You only need one of them. You can sell something else. But most countries forbid these kind of things, and that's the more Republican approach. And before Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, I think the liberal libertarian was really the absolutely dominant approach. And we've seen that, well, it doesn't go so well. It's a threat to democracy. It's not really the solution. And also some of the manager of the GAFAs, for them, nations or public administrations, they are kind of outdated, not useful things. And I think that's a big mistake.
You know, as we're talking about this, one of our responsibilities of this panel is that we need to start thinking about proposals or suggestions for the leaders of the G7. So you're already, I mean, what is interesting, you're giving us the two alternatives, almost literally two alternatives. So maybe as we're heading towards the end, we can start thinking about what is the best alternative. I mean, what do you suggest to the leaders? So before we do that, Huda, I know that you've spoken about this. Huda Idris, she's the CEO of .health. You know, when you think about health issues, and then we're going to talk about banking issues, I mean, there's also, we can talk about big policy in terms of data, but when it really comes down to using, the way data is used just on a daily basis, either from the business perspective or, you know, saving lives, I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the two views that Anya's outlining, we've seen both of those views play out. We've seen one instance play out in the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, but we've also seen governments fail citizens in protecting their rights.
Right.
We've seen massive breaches that also don't see the light of media very much happen on the government's end. I don't want to sit here and trust our government to enforce
to protect you. Yeah.
All the it's the same thing of personal agency. I really do see data as a matter of agency for people. And I think that needs to come away from the two extremes of it is private industry only or it is regulation only, and truly come down to the center of when we're talking about data ownership, and if it is in fact owned by the individual, what are the controls that are available to the individual? So I operate in the world of healthcare, and governments all around the world, Canada's not the only one, governments around the world have really been stringent on who owns health data.
Right.
And legally, each of us own all our own health data.
Right.
But how does it actually play out in the real world? Hospitals, clinics, pharmacies will keep this data within their silos and make it very difficult for you as an individual to gain access to any of it. And that doesn't solve the problem. So what I think we need to be looking at, and the reason I'm a bit nervous about saying regulation is the answer here, is because when we go down the path of regulation, and the Senate hearings of Mark Zuckerberg were a bit of a hint in this direction, it's government, technology is not government's strongest suit. If I can just put that out there. We're not great at it.
I do agree.
Like, not just a single government, but governments, period. We're not good at it. The worst part of all of it is that they're very reactive. They're not proactive about all of the policies. So I've worked in the world of finance, now in healthcare, and when you sit down with someone who's coming from a government angle with a technology lens, the way that they're approaching it is very arcane. And I think that is difficult for private industry to innovate. So I don't want to get in a position where, because of regulations, we can no longer innovate. Because of regulation, we can't save lives. I don't want to go down that path. So I think we need to bring
You know, see what's fascinating, particularly, for example, information that has to do with your health. You would assume, and I'm not even talking about what's going on now, but the issue of having access to your own health information to your own files, it has always been a nightmare. And so you would assume that because now it's easier, you can literally, they can send you an email, it would be much easier, which appears to be your right to know if your heart's working or if, what's going on, if you're being poisoned. I mean, just kind of these basic things, or if your doctor is is a bad doctor. There's malpractice going on. We don't have, and part of the reason this kind of takes to the debate as to what's the role of government has to do with, there has been reasons to hide that information from the patient. One, either because they don't want you to know because of bad doctors or bad medical practices, or two, they're afraid that someone else is going to have access to the information and then you get in trouble because you weren't careful enough. So, and this also has to do with the bank information, exactly the same thing. It's, it's much easier now because we do a lot of the banking, over internet, but getting information, from a bank, especially now in this era of money laundering and all these concerns of the way how money is moving around, it is very difficult. So I can see the government saying, I'm going to protect you, not only make sure you have the right to have access to your information, but if they misuse the information, I can punish. Banks don't like that, or do they? We're talking.
Well, thanks for that one. I don't remember that in the prep for this panel, which is fine. Hey, listen, first I got to say it's a pleasure to be here actually as the odd one out in this panel, because that's not normally the case. I think the point though is that data in and of itself is not inherently good or evil. It's what we do with it that's the problem. And I don't sit here and have a solution for that either. What I'd like to talk about though is how we get to a solution for that. And I think thematically what we've heard today a whole bunch of times is it's becoming a bit of a truism that when you've got more diversity, when you've got more inclusion, you get to better decisions, you get to better business outcomes. Right? I think that's great. As it relates to data, to analytics, to cybersecurity, to all of these things, the elephant in the room is that we need more women to be part of this. So this panel is engineered and not representative of really what the population looks like. What does the population
look like?
Well, it would be take this room and invert the gender. And you're going to have a lot more men than you have women, generally speaking. And I think that's kind of the elephant in the room here. I mean, first, another problem we should call out is there's not enough guys in this room. So, guys, everyone phone a friend and call someone over. And we need to do something. So paradoxically, from my perspective, to get more women into this, you have to actually get more men into this, right? Men inhabit the positions of power still. How do we get this onto their radar from an inclusion perspective? And then how do we get more women into this from the discipline perspective of learning some of these things? And at least for my bank, at Scotiabank, we think we play a really important role in the social and economic fabric of the countries that we operate in. And so we've been trying to create opportunities through academic partnerships, through sponsorships, through other things like that, to actually make ourselves better and better. You heard a friend and colleague of mine, Barb Mason, open this morning. In our case, we've tried to link this to performance. We believe we get better business outcomes if we become more diverse and more inclusive.
I have to say something about Dan Moore. He's the Chief Risk Officer at Scotiabank. When we were talking about this panel, your assistant commented, something very interesting about Dan is that he will not participate in a panel if there's no women. And I thought...
so it's Mike, because I'm pinch hitting for Dan. But yeah, the latter part about I made a public commitment to not participate in panels that weren't gender balanced.
And so this is fascinating because this is kind of like the steps that our colleagues can take in terms of assuring not only the representation of women on some of these issues where frequently there are no women in the audience, but also in terms of kind of being a role model for the rest of the institution. Let me go back to this idea of these two models in terms of what we should do with data. Because there are moments, and I want to go back to your example of Snapchat, I think was fabulous. What do we do with these types of situations where you do clearly see that through social media they are promoting violence or discrimination? I'm going to give you an interesting case. I had one of the women on my show, a very interesting Mexican analyst, she was telling me that she had been interviewing people who had voted for Donald Trump, right? Trying to understand, and it's important for the Mexican audience, everybody to understand, why did you vote and how did they use social media? And what they said is that it was their way of expressing themselves. And for the first time, there's these groups of people who felt that their voice had not been heard through the filter of formal media. So basically, we are at a moment where both the private sector and governments have to decide how much of this do you filter. What is the policy? I mean, what should happen? I'm just going back to this where you have the little crown and it basically changes the color of your face and the color of, and the way your face looks.
I mean, I think the most important thing is to be informed and not be afraid. And the truth is, as Mike said, I think that there is an opportunity for both good and for both, evil, and for even sometimes for business, which can sometimes operate in a gray zone. I'll take your health example. On the plus side, you have an ability where you can have data analyze, IBM's Watson can analyze gigabytes of genomic data that used to take researchers days and days, and it can do it in a couple of minutes and tell you if you might be at risk for cancer.
Right.
You can have algorithms that analyze your medication, your behavior, your family history. So that's all, I think that's amazing. And as a technology optimist, I think those are the things that are gonna make our lives better. Where it gets complicated is that you start getting into shadow data, which is, say you're the health example. Okay, well, what if your healthcare provider accessed your Netflix profile and they found out that you spent 8 hours live streaming Cupcake Wars or whatever hypothetical example I'm using in this situation? Well, what if they access your food delivery and they say, you know what, here you are complaining and your insurance company wants XYZ, but we see that you order pizza like 4 times a week. What if they access your phone and it says, you know what, you're not actually walking the prescribed 10,000 steps a day? What if they look at your purchasing habits? And you're buying cigarettes and you're buying your purchasing cigarettes. So, they already are starting to do that now. Insurance companies are starting to do that now with the things that you're searching for on Google. Think of all the things that you pour your heart out into Google about your life, your symptoms. Think about what you look for on WebMD, where everything always ends up in death or cancer, right? So, I mean, when you think of it this way, I also hesitate to say regulation, but the reality is we have to be informed. So who here is on Facebook? Who here has read Facebook's terms of service?
Yeah.
Or how many of us just click update, 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 we don't care, just get me my thing to work. So in order for us to have conversations about the right policy, we have to understand what it means to have ethical data practices, which include transparency, they include opt-in, they include giving people a very clear, standard, easy to understand language of what information is being collected, where it's being stored, how it's being used, and what's being done with it.
But then that's the government. The government has to do that?
I don't think it's government. I actually think it starts with citizens. I actually think it starts with citizens being informed who can draw the boundary, and then companies that can meet halfway, because, Facebook is not going to automatically regulate itself. They have shown us that they haven't. And the Cambridge Analytica example wasn't actually a violation of their terms and service. No. They didn't sell your data, they gave it to a partner, which you agreed to when you signed onto the platform. So if you have a problem with this, then that means that you as a citizen have to do an audit of every single app that you use, and every single social network that you use, and every single time you use a search engine to understand who owns this data, what's being collected, how's it being stored.
Can I just build? I'm sorry, go ahead, Huda.
I mostly just want to move us away, and maybe yours is more relevant to what Rob is mentioning. I understand that given the current times and the current discussion, there's a lot of fear-mongering around all the evils of data, but I also want us to talk about all the remarkable things that we haven't even gotten to, because we're so afraid of our quiz results being with Cambridge Analytica. Like, I do want us to move away from that and into the real power of what data that is controlled by the user, that can be revoked at any time, that is disclosed to them in an appropriate manner, can actually do. I want us to talk more about all the good stuff.
I would say rather the opposite. I would say rather the opposite. I mean, we all were so happy and so without any criticism, without any question, into digital, into data. I'm a digital optimist as well. But I think some of us are just starting to be aware of the issues. And it would be a pity to say, oh, no, don't be afraid, there are good things.
Be informed.
We all know that there are great things. I think there's no one in here which doesn't think that it's great that we have data, we have better policies, better mobility, better health. That's okay, but I think we have to start to discuss about the danger and what should we do, and who should do what.
Well, Dan. I think the answer is going to be a little bit of both, though, as it is in most things in life, right? And so I think what Rahaf was saying was that there is an onus on citizens to be aware, to inform themselves. They have a right to meaningful and informed consent for both collection and for use. And most of us, I've read the Facebook terms of service, but I've still clicked accept, even though there's stuff in there that I'm not really that enthusiastic about. But there's been way more good than there's been bad. Right. And so, if I use an analogy, not a digital one, there might be a speed limit, there might be a law, but there are times when choosing to drive at that speed limit is actually unsafe, right? So you need both. And I think that's...
When you think about in terms of creating public policy around this, which goes back to like what one of our responsibilities of this panel is to try to think what recommendations would you make to the leaders in the G7. I mean, they're in a very difficult situation because every time there is an attempt to do any type of legislation to either remotely control internet or remotely control information or anything that has, there is just, you can hear the screaming through the social media, and and there's political cost in trying to have this conversation. So my experience has been a lot of leaders have decided not to even touch it because in the case of Cambridge Analytica, it is basically messing with Facebook or messing with the social network and telling them how to control. And now people are actually talking about, start charging Facebook. I mean, you create an environment that makes it very difficult for politicians and governments to make decisions. Am I wrong?
Totally agree. And I think that the audience of Mark Zuckerberg in front of the Senate also showed two things.
Right.
First thing, that politicians woke up slowly and very late.
Right.
And the second one is the generation gap.
Yes.
Between Mark Zuckerberg geek generation and male, white, quite old senators.
Right. Right. No, the questions was kind of embarrassing. Right.
You were not really sure if they knew what their questions were. So that's one of the problems. But at least I think now people become aware that we have to talk about it.
Right.
I'm not telling that there is one solution or another, but we have to talk about it. We have to be aware. And I also was a liberal libertarian. A couple of, maybe 1 year ago, I thought that nations can't do anything. These companies are global. So
right.
What can a nation, what can Switzerland, such a small country, do for that?
Wow.
And even in social and workforce legislation, how can we regulate? People are working nomad, they're working in the cloud, so how can we still use territory to make, because laws, they're related to a territory, so they're not in the cloud.
Right.
And still, I think there are things to do. I at least see two things. First, regulation. We notice that it's possible. There is the EU General Data Regulation, Protection Regulation, GDPR, which will be enforced on the 25th of May. I'm not saying that's a great regulation, far from that. And I'm on the board of a company. We're really struggling with some of the things where it goes back to data we already collected. What should we do with that data? So it all in the bin. No, we won't do that. So that's a very difficult point. But still, at least it showed that it's possible. Nations, if they go together in the youth, for example, they can do something. We are not victims of the GAFAs. We, the citizens, but government, it's a kind of a aggregation of citizens. They can do something, and I think that's very important, because otherwise, what would it mean if nations can't do anything? It means that only money is ruling the world, and I think that takes us back to the jungle law, the law of the stronger, and it's kind of 4,000 years. It's quite decadent.
Talking about money, Dan. No, one of the industries that is regulated for all kinds of reasons, not only because of of the information you handle are the banks. Banks are accustomed to regulation, sometimes more, sometimes less. In terms of the way regulation is used and is viewed by the banks, I mean, does a bank consider that helpful because at least it gives you guidelines for everybody to work around? I mean, I'm just trying to understand because I could imagine a bank feeling even protected by these types of regulations because it's just clear, black and white, you know, and maybe some gray areas as to what you can do and not do with data that comes, for example, from the banking sector.
Yeah, so I'll sound a little bit repetitive here, I suppose. So first of all, yes, we're used to working in a highly regulated environment, and we're okay with that. We welcome that. In fact, owing to the fact that we play a role in transmitting the economic policy of any country that we're in. And we play a role in the safety and soundness and viability of the economies in that. And so you need some guidelines.
Do you appreciate the rules?
To make that flow, and that there's utility in that for everyone to just make things work. Within that, though, and at Scotiabank, we believe that we're here, we exist to build the economy of everyone. We believe that our customers have the right to be better off. And that guides what we do. It guides not just what we do with data, but it guides all of our other actions. What it doesn't let us do, though, is presuppose what's right for any given individual. Right? We can have a whole bunch of data, but if one person decides that what's more important to them than saving on interest costs is the life dream trip to wherever, well, that's for them to decide, not for us to decide, irrespective of what data we've got on different people.
See, because in a sense, the banks, what they do is they hold the information about your financial and personal situation. So it's up to you whether you make decisions you personally make decisions on that situation. So it's easier, I think, for a sector like the banking industry in order to determine what is best for the sector and their clients. Where it gets very murky is all these other areas when we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about YouTube, we're talking about, Twitter, where in many ways they impose up to a certain point such a burden in terms of policy on policymakers because I could imagine a situation in elections in any country where you basically have groups using Twitter to promote violence on election day. What does the government do? So we don't have regulations, and no one would even dare try to regulate that. Or once again, in the case of the way Facebook has been, there's a lot of complaints on YouTube that they're taking down videos if there's a gun or a gun in a minor, and there's people who think that is horrible. Because at the end of the day, there's this question mark. If there's going to be control, the government clearly has to play a role, and we're always, tell me if I'm wrong, very nervous about the role of government because we don't trust governments with this.
Yeah, I think on the government end, I don't think governments have no role to play. I think they do have a role to play. I don't think it's entirely on governments, though. So I think two main things that that governments around the world can do is one, actually build technology capability in-house. So the Obama administration actually did this really well under his rule, where they had a United States digital service that was really stacked. And they had private industry people that were consultants to the government, and they really brought back healthcare.gov for the United States. And that's a big deal because that's a massive country. We need to be doing more of that. We do not have the technology capability to even start to understand what policies we need to be having in place. The other thing that I think we need to do is the way that policies are made needs to be way more agile than it is today.
Right.
They are so reactive that by the time GDPR is in play, I bet you anything, all the companies have already found loopholes or other ways of doing the exact same thing they were doing before. It is way too slow with given the pace of technology. So I think we need to start becoming a lot more agile and inserting certain accountability frameworks that are broad enough to be able to respond to, instead of having a 10-hour Senate hearing for one company. What are accountability frameworks that we can put in place that maybe private companies and large public companies are reporting on consistently that can be looked at, similar to how we look at quarter results for all the public companies? Why can't we have accountability around how data is protected also?
I still go back to this question that makes me extremely nervous because I love the example you presented. I mean, should government play a role or who plays a role? And yes, we can have informed citizens, and we need to talk about it. And we can talk about this panel. You spoke about this a year ago, and no one listened. But part of the problem is when you have these platforms that not only have your information, but also use that information because you're looking for websites that basically promote violence, or promote stereotypes, or promote a view of the world that we consider is not appropriate in a democracy. That, I think, is the more difficult question, because then part of it has to do with data, but it also has to do, let's talk about the topic of this forum, about the role of women, and so in these in big data. So I mean, is there a role for government? And I know a lot of people say no. This is kind of the libertarian view of the world. We have to educate our citizens, and we have to educate people to reject these points of view, regardless of what you find on the social media. Do you understand? I don't know what would be the recommendations for G7 leaders.
I mean, to go back, I know we've been talking, the reason why we talk about informed citizens is because informed citizens have agency as consumers and the companies that they choose to purchase products from and who they decide to elect. So if you suddenly start saying, you know what, I'm not sure I want Facebook to have XYZ data about me, and you start talking to your MP about it, you start raising it as an issue, that's then going to force them, if they want to be reelected, that they need to pay attention to these issues, and they will start to develop perspectives that reflect what their constituents want. Just like if once Facebook, I mean, Facebook is a really interesting example because he went on his little shame parade.
Right.
But at the end of the day, not very many people deleted their accounts and everything. Their share price didn't really suffer, so there was technically no consequence. But let's not forget that consumers using these platforms to mobilize around issues, to say this is important to us, can have massive change. Look at all the movements that we've been seeing, look at the protests that have been organized, look at when a company does something and then the backlash that rises up because consumers say, you know what, I don't think I'm gonna buy this product anymore. So the reason we start with be informed and not afraid is because there are so many amazing things to do, but we can't just turn a blind eye and say, well, the government will handle it. We first have to decide what kind of world we want to live in. I would like to personally live in a world where we can take advantage of all the amazing opportunities that can make us healthier and happier and more creative. But on the flip side, I'm not willing to do that at the expense of selling, the digital version of my identity to the highest bidder. And if that is my view as a citizen, then it is my responsibility to go out there and to make sure that the politicians and the companies I engage with reflect this view, or I can choose to withdraw my support and put it elsewhere. And this is the same thing. I mean, when the Obama administration, when they had their digital department, when they had their policies, they had a chief digital officer who was responsible for translating these things into open data initiatives, into education boot camps, into coding boot camps, into hackathons. They made it a priority because that priority was reflected in the voters and what they wanted to see. So business also has a really great role where you guys can lead by example by providing alternatives to consumers by saying, hey, we're the bank that treats your data ethically, and having people make decisions based on that. Without those baby steps, we're just skipping steps. You can't just turn to government and be like, you fix this. We have to fix it level by level in order for the entire structure to hold. And we're the foundations of that structure.
I totally agree with what you said. I think we have two things to do. The first one is more about government. We have to educate more young people, less young people. It's really, I don't know if it was your case, but when I was young, they explained to us that marketing is not reality. They explained to us, if you see a woman smoking and she's very happy, you won't be happy if you smoke. And it's just very easy. Images, how can you explain images? And now we have to explain young people when something is free. It's not free. It just means you're the product. And that's quite easy, but we have to explain that to everyone. The second thing is more difficult, but I really believe, I mean, regulation, I was happy about that European regulation because I really thought that we can't do anything. And we can do something. That's the good, that made me more optimistic. But more than in such a regulation, which I totally agree with what you said, and really there are problems in it and it's too slow. But I think that pressure will put all the stakeholders at the discussion table. And we need that. We need the businesses, we need the GAFAs, we need the other businesses, we need the nations, we need the NGOs, we need civil society, we need everyone around the table. And I'm optimistic, and I really believe in a Geneva Convention. That's what we did with war. We couldn't get rid of war, but there was one Genevan guy, he thought that maybe it's not very good if people are hurt and they're just dying on the battlefield, and that's the way Red Cross was created. It wasn't nations, it wasn't a policy, it was just one guy and then his friends, and then it became something. And I'm quite optimistic that the cybersecurity tech accord, which was signed on 17th of April, that might be a baby step into the right direction. At least 34 multinational companies. Facebook was one of them. No Russian or Chinese one yet, but that may be a step in that direction. We all need to be together. It's not a government problem or a government solution. It can't be only the companies' self-regulation. And it's a great view to think that citizens can do it alone, but I think that's even longer than it takes governments to do it. But we need them.
You know, at a conference, Bill Clinton went down to Mexico and he was speaking, and you know, it was very interesting to listen to him after he was president years later. And he said something I thought, you know, and that I think we forgot about what democracies and how fragile they are. And he said, you know, I believe that democracy is going to survive from here on. It's going to be the way that governments are going to function. And he said, thanks to internet. Because if anything has been able to help democracy is the fact that there's all this information out there, that in one way or the other, it makes people aware that there's this way of government. So, and I kind of, when I'm thinking and listening to this conversation, I mean, I'm sure it's very difficult for many of you out there to remember when we couldn't do banking online, or when I still remember we had, God, you got to figure out how old I am. You had to go to the bank with a little book. Remember, you had the little books, and the teller would write down how much money you were taking out, or you would express your love through the telephone. I mean, but what democracy is, what internet has done, and the access has helped, I believe, democracy. What worries me is that in terms of all this personal information about us out there, and I do get a little paranoid when I start, and I don't know if you guys do, but I basically was thinking of buying a product, and then bam, immediately I go to another, you know, just 20 minutes later I start seeing all these ads. It's just that intrusion in our privacy is very uncomfortable. Now, I guess the question is, the cultural...
You have to put your browser on private.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's the point. These things can be controlled, but people have to choose to control them.
Right. And when you have children, and I go back to the issue of education, you know, you can educate people up to a certain point. My question is, I have a feeling, and I'm asking this to the audience, is that I think if you're talking about the 18 and under, they really don't care who has their information. That, I think, is an issue.
I'm not so sure about that, because I have two children, one is 20, one is 15. Neither of them is on Facebook. They hate Facebook. They don't want to share their life with the whole world.
They might also hate Facebook because their parents are on it or something.
Right, yeah.
Personal experience, three kids that are teens or preteen, and I would say there's instances, I don't think it's that they don't care, I think they're better at making the conscious choice. That's what I see in my children, and granted that's a focus group of one with 3 kids. But they are much more aware, and will frequently tell me, Dad, did you know if you did this, then you exposed that?
Right.
And so their level of understanding and awareness is, I think, a lot higher. Now, we might disagree as parents with more life experience who have seen more bad things with the choices they make sometimes, but I don't think we should extend that to assuming that they're actually not making a choice.
Right. Because, well, let me then bring it to another generation, the generation, you know, X. I mean, there is information that is being shared that my generation would have never shared you just don't talk about some of these things that I see are being discussed in Facebook, where parents are there and uncles. In Mexico, it's very interesting because in Facebook page, you have the whole generations going up and down. So then they have to create the second, they have like the second Facebook page, the one where your parents are. Anyway, but But I do think that the sense of privacy that we have always worked with during my, my generation is very different. And I do think that there is much more willingness to be much open about the information, except when there is a major disaster and information is shared that affects you, right?
Yeah, I think there's another layer to this. Aside from it just being, do I care about my privacy or do I not care about it? People increasingly, young people and old people, are using data as currency. Data is quickly becoming the currency of our generation.
Right.
And it is essentially the way that we transact and get services. So maybe the price of sharing our likes and dislikes with Facebook is that we get to connect with our friends, and maybe that's okay for some people. Maybe that is the price that they're willing to pay. On the flip side, maybe someone wants to be in private browsing mode and they don't want to get, I don't know, some coupon on some site for the product that they were looking for, because they're not willing to transact in that manner. And I think all of our regulations look at data as this sort of ambiguous, fuzzy thing. And I think we need to pull it back and start looking at it as currency. What would happen, and this is a good question for Mike actually, what would happen if somebody started telling you how to use your money? How to buy certain things and not buy certain things.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you're reinforcing the point I was making before, right? Like, we can do things that we believe are for the best interests of people, but what you can't do, it's the lead the horse to water cliche, right? Once they're there, you can't make them drink. I think I want to come back to something that you asked about a few times, though, which is just the role of regulation, the role of government, impending G7. And I just want to remind everyone that those halls of power in government and those discussions in G7 are still largely an echo chamber populated by men, right? And so if we buy into what we opened with and what we've talked about a few times, I mean, let's get some of the insight that's sitting up on the stage with me into conversations like that, because I think we get better business outcomes.
There comes the first suggestion. Just very briefly, any other very specific suggestions for our leaders, mainly male, at the G7? Just if we could have just maybe bullet points that we could take away.
Get everyone at the table and start the
conversation.
These questions.
Yeah.
Data is great, but we just have to ask ourselves, what are the rules?
I'd say to really cultivate the expertise that exists. I think there are a lot of people, citizens, that would be more than willing to volunteer their expertise, but there is no way in current government to interface to do that.
And you have the last
I would say
suggestion.
Looking at cybersecurity and data privacy from a feminist lens, it's not enough to say to women, don't use Twitter or Facebook. We need to be looking at ways that we can make this equitable and make access to data available to everybody, including women.
And get more women at the table discussing on this. A big applause for this wonderful panel. Thank you.